Well, my intro died. I don't know what was up with that. Anyway, good evening from the National Weather Service office in Lake Charles. I'm meteorologist Donald Jones with a 10:30 p.m. update on what is still potential tropical cyclone number 6. There hasn't been a whole lot of change in the overall structure of the potential tropical cyclone number 6. That's a mouthful. This evening, it is still a very elongated area of low pressure, and extends essentially from the southern Gulf all the way up towards the northern Gulf, and it's the highest winds are actually displaced on the western side of the storm, which is fairly unusual for a tropical system, but being as it's not an actual true tropical system right now, that's not necessarily unexpected. We do anticipate that as we go through the next 24 hours or so, by this time tomorrow, though, that we will be looking at a more well-defined center of circulation. Those winds will begin to come back around in a more traditional tropical form, and we will have a more organized, probably tropical storm on our hands. The next name would be Francine, the F storm on the Hurricane Center's list. That would be the 6th named storm of the hurricane season so far. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what to expect here over the next few days, and we're also going to talk about the potential impacts expected across our region. As always, this is a live interactive briefing, so if you have any questions as we go through our briefing, feel free to post them in our comments section. We're on X, Facebook, and YouTube this evening, so lots of ways to get in touch with us. If you do have a question, we'll answer those just as soon as we wrap up the actual briefing portion. Let's go ahead and jump into it here this evening. We are looking at potential tropical cyclone 6. Again, has changed very little in structure overall this evening. Still a very elongated storm. I'm going to show you the satellite here in just a second, but we are expecting the storm to gradually get its act together a little more. It is expected to develop a low-level circulation, and it already has winds of tropical storm strength. We're looking at about 50-mile-an-hour winds out there right now in some of these bands. So once it gets a closed low-level center of circulation, it will then be classified as a tropical storm, and it'll probably start off already as kind of a mid-intensity tropical storm sometime tomorrow. Based on the current forecast track, we are expecting impacts across southeast Texas and southwest Louisiana, as well as south central Louisiana, and probably also into southeast Louisiana, maybe even into parts of coastal Mississippi and Alabama. The biggest issue right now, at least as it stands at the moment, is going to be the potential for heavy rains, heavy flooding rains. We're looking at anywhere from up to 6 to possibly 10 inches of rain in some locations, maybe even some locally higher amounts possible on top of that. We're also looking at the potential for some storm surge. We're going to be looking at the potential for some winds. The forecast track does have the storm reaching Category 1 hurricane strength, and actually the latest update from the National Hurricane Center has it a little bit stronger of a Category 1 hurricane at landfall. So there will be the potential for some hurricane force winds across probably a fairly narrow area, but it is going to exist. And then we're also going to be looking at the threat for tornadoes as well, as is the case with all landfalling tropical systems. This is the latest. This is actually the infrared satellite view this evening. Now that the sun's gone down, we can't get a visible view of it at the moment, but you can see it is still a very elongated storm. This activity up here is associated with it broadly. There is still a cold front that's kind of extending across the Gulf Coast here, the northern Gulf Coast. That was the cold front that brought kind of our nicer air. This is roughly about where it is at the moment, somewhere up in that area there. But the circulation itself, or what will probably eventually become the circulation, is still located way down here. And notice all of this shower and thunderstorm activity on the western side of that. That's where those strongest winds are actually located this evening, those 50-plus mile-per-hour winds across the area. But this is associated with it. It's all kind of elongated right now, so you can't really say it's a circulation. But gradually what I think is going to happen here is as we go through the night and into tomorrow, this is going to begin to kind of wrap around a center of circulation somewhere up in that area there. And we'll begin to see the characteristics of a more well-defined actual tropical system. Now, where that center of circulation actually develops is still somewhat up in the air, and that's why the forecast track and intensity is still a little bit, iffy at the moment. There is still some room for error for this track to shift west and east as we go, especially as we go into tomorrow, but really over the next couple of days. So this is the 10 p.m. advisory from the National Hurricane Center. I'll go ahead and make this full screen for you so you can take a little bit closer look at it here. Maximum sustained winds, as I said, even though it's not an actual tropical system, are still around 50 miles per hour on the western side. You can see the little orange circle there. That is where the tropical storm force winds, if you want to call it that at the moment, are located on the western side of the storm. And that's fairly unusual. Traditionally, we see those storms are in tropical systems. We see winds on the eastern side of the storm. I'm trying to see where my little webcam went. You can't see me. That's okay. You don't need to see me at the moment. But essentially, what will happen here over the next 24 hours or so is we'll begin to see those winds wrap around the southern and then eastern side of the storm, and that is more typical of what we would expect to see in a more traditional tropical system. Now, as I mentioned before, we are expecting the storm to intensify to at least a Category 1 hurricane prior to making landfall. Maximum sustained winds now at landfall are forecasted to be somewhere in the range of about 80 miles per hour. So that's going to make it a mid to strong Category 1 hurricane. And it's not out of the realm of possibility that we could see a Category 2 hurricane, depending on exactly how strong this or how rapidly the storm intensifies over the next couple of days. It is in a generally favorable environment. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. But right now, the official forecast is a mid-range Category 1 hurricane at landfall with maximum sustained winds near 80 miles per hour. Let me go ahead and come back to me here. So with that in mind, what we're going to talk about next here is the expected time of arrival and the probabilities of seeing both tropical storm and hurricane force winds. So let's go ahead and talk about that here. I'm going to go ahead and make this full screen again because this is kind of difficult to see otherwise. So what we're looking at here first, this is the probability of seeing tropical storm force winds across the region. And this has come up a little bit from earlier this afternoon. And will probably continue to come up as we get closer in time to the actual landfall here over the next 2 days or so. So right now we're looking at about a 30 to 40% chance of seeing tropical storm force winds across southwest Louisiana and even higher along the immediate Cameron coast. You see the thin line there of the kind of the orange color. That's a 40 to 50% chance. So at this point, we're getting into a pretty decent probability of seeing at least tropical storm force winds across southeast Texas and southwest Louisiana. You can see the same, roughly the same probabilities for southeast Texas, 30 to 40%, up to as far north as, say, Hardin County, and a 30 to 40% chance of seeing tropical storm force winds in and around the Vermilion Bay area. Now, the probabilities go a little bit lower as you go up towards the Lafayette area and move inland. So the Lafayette area is looking at roughly about a 20 to 30% chance right now. But again, these probabilities as a whole will continue to rise as the storm intensifies and as we get closer in time to the storm actually making landfall. Now, if the forecast tracker intensity does change, we could be looking at significant changes in these probabilities. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? So just kind of bear that in mind as we go forward here. But at this point, we're getting pretty close to a 50-50 shot of seeing tropical storm force winds across parts of southwest Louisiana with this system. And we're still 2 days out. Now, before, on the previous briefing we did here, there was actually a less than 5% chance of seeing hurricane force winds anywhere. You can see now there is roughly a 5 to 10% chance of seeing hurricane force winds right along the immediate coastline of Cameron Parish and Vermilion Parish. So these are also beginning to gradually ramp up as we're now expecting a slightly stronger storm, and we're also getting a little bit closer in time. Now, that's still a relatively low probability, but that kind of gives you an indication of things to come here. These probabilities, I expect, are going to continue to climb across a much narrower area for the hurricane force winds, but it will be climbing as we get closer in time and as we get a better handle on the exact intensity of the storm. Let me come back over here again. We'll talk real quick now. We're going to talk about the most likely time of arrival. I'm immediately going to send you back to the full screen because, again, this is easier to see on there. So this is the most likely time of arrival for those tropical storm force winds. If we're going to see them, this is when we expect to see them. And for those of you who are planning on making preparations, which you should be if you're anywhere in southeast Texas or South Louisiana, this is basically the deadline. This is when you want to have all of your preparations done. There have not been any evacuation orders issued yet, but if there are, this is when you want to be out of Dodge by. So we're looking at roughly between about 8 a.m. and noon Wednesday morning for the onset of those tropical storm force winds. Now, landfall itself is not expected to be until sometime Wednesday evening, probably between about 4 p.m. and we'll call it midnight for now. But it looks like it's going to be later in the day on Wednesday. But those tropical storm force winds are going to be well out ahead of the actual center of circulation or eye of the storm. So we expect those tropical storm force winds to begin Wednesday morning between about 8 a.m. and noon. Again, should the forecast track change, should the speed of the storm change, this could all also change as well. But at least for right now, that's the time frame we're looking at. So that's your deadline. If you are making preparations, you want to have them all done by Wednesday morning. This is the earliest reasonable time of arrival. So if we do wind up seeing shifts in track or anything along those lines, this is the earliest that we can expect to see the onset of tropical storm force winds. And we're looking at very late Tuesday night for that onset. So roughly about 8-ish hours earlier than the expected time. That gives you a little bit of a buffer window from the earliest reasonable that we can expect those winds to begin to the most likely time for them to begin. So I'm going to come back over to the full screen here. I want to talk to you a little bit about what's driving this storm. If you were with us earlier, it's kind of the same idea. So what we're looking at here, and the reason why this storm is going to be moving off to the north the way it is, did this just die on me? I'll come back and still here. So here's the storm itself. We'll just call it a tropical storm for now, because by tomorrow it probably will be. It's going to be driven by two primary factors. One, we've got a cold front. That cold front I mentioned right along the Gulf Coast there. That's the cold front that brought us this very nice first taste of fall, the false fall, as we sometimes call it. So this is just sitting up here. This is an area of low pressure. Then we've got an area of high pressure over here over the eastern Gulf of Mexico. And you can see kind of the wind gradients here and how this turns. This high pressure comes all the way out to roughly about the central Gulf of Mexico. So the winds in high pressure spin clockwise. And this is a trough, so the winds along this are actually kind of paralleling it. So it's moving kind of like that. So it's essentially, the storm is going to wrap around this area of high pressure and just kind of drift to the north. The fact that it's fairly far away from the center of that high pressure is the reason it's going to be moving very slowly. It's only moving about 5 miles an hour right now. It's a very slow drift to the north. Now, as it approaches this cold front, it's going to begin to accelerate into the front, because the cold front itself is an area of low pressure, as is the tropical storm and or hurricane, whatever it winds up being. So these two areas are actually going to kind of gravitate towards one another. So as it approaches the cold front, these stronger winds that are paralleling it are going to kind of pick it up and accelerate it. So it's going to be moving faster as it approaches the coastline, and then once it gets inland, it's going to move off to the northeast at a much faster clip. So we're not worried about this storm stalling. In fact, we're worried about it. Actually, we're not worried about it, but we're expecting it to accelerate as it moves towards the coast and gets inland. So that kind of gives you an idea as far as what's actually driving this storm. We're pretty confident in that. There's going to be a little bit of shift probably in the forecast track, but the overall general philosophy about what's driving the storm is not expected to change a whole lot here in the coming days. This is pretty solid, and we expect it to kind of stay that way. Sea surface temperatures are very favorable. We saw this earlier. We're still looking at sea surface temperatures ranging from anywhere between 86 and 88 degrees across the Gulf of Mexico. You need a minimum sea surface temperature of 80 degrees to support tropical cyclone development, and we're well above that still. So sea surface temperatures, very warm, very favorable for additional development. Wind shear is the other thing that we look at when we're talking about developing tropical systems. And I'll make this full screen for you here because it's kind of a messy graphic. But essentially what we're looking at, the bright reds and oranges, that's areas of high wind shear. You can see that occurring essentially right over the top of us at the moment and right along the coastline. Those are areas of high wind shear associated with that cold front we just mentioned. Further to the south across the southern Gulf and western Gulf, though, you see those blues and greens. That's areas of very low wind shear, and that's where the storm is right now. So conditions are pretty favorable for it to develop and will continue to be favorable all the way up until about the time it gets close to the coastline. At that point, I think that wind shear is going to start to influence it or begin to kind of shear it apart a little bit. So it may reach its whatever maximum intensity it's at. It's probably going to reach it before it gets to the coast, and then may actually begin a little bit of a weakening trend as it gets right to the coastline. That remains to be seen, but generally speaking, when we have increasing wind shear, it tends to start to tear storms apart and weaken them. So we may be in a situation where the storm may be beginning to weaken right at landfall. It's going to depend on exactly where it encounters that wind shear, whether it's off the coast or right along the coast. But generally speaking, for the next couple of days, it's going to be in a pretty favorable environment. There's a lot of moisture surrounding the storm, not a lot of dry air, so conditions overall are pretty favorable for fairly steady development. There are a few models that do show a rapid intensification phase. Not a lot of them, but there are some. So don't be too surprised if this storm winds up being a little bit stronger than is even being indicated right now. You know, the general rule of thumb is to always prepare for one category higher than the storm is actually being forecasted for. And that's not necessarily a bad philosophy in this case. We're calling for a category 1. Don't be surprised if we end up with a category 2. You know, it's definitely not out of the realm of possibility with this system. So now let's talk about impacts expected across our region. I want to start with rainfall because our rainfall threat is probably going to be the biggest overall threat. At least that's what we're looking at right now. We are expecting significant rainfall to begin on Tuesday with some of those outer rain bands And then they're going to gradually kind of increase in coverage and intensity as we go into Wednesday. So on Tuesday, we're looking at a slight a slight risk of excessive rainfall. And what that means, you can see the legend down there in the bottom right. There's roughly a 15% chance of seeing flash flooding within 25 miles of anywhere that's in that yellow highlighted area. So that goes from Beaumont to Lake Charles to Lafayette to New Iberia over towards Baton Rouge, New Orleans. All of those areas are in that slight risk. As we go into Wednesday, that risk area expands even further. So we're looking at a much larger area that is going to be under risk for potential flash flooding. And again, under that slight risk, that 15% risk. Now, I expect that as we get closer in time, by tomorrow, we're going to get into some of these higher risk categories. This moderate risk, it wouldn't surprise me at all to see a moderate risk area be highlighted across parts of the region where we're expecting the most rainfall. And then once we get to within about a day of the storm, it wouldn't surprise me if we see a high risk for an even smaller area. The bottom line is we're going to be looking at significant rainfall totals. I mean, that's, if you know anything about hurricanes, you know that's one thing it's very capable of doing, is producing very heavy rainfall. Here's a look at our forecast rainfall totals, at least as it stands right now. This is based on the current forecast track. We're looking at anywhere between about 8 to 12 inches possible across coastal portions of southwest and south central Louisiana, essentially from Jefferson County all the way east to St. Mary Parish. As you get a little bit further east into southeast Louisiana, those numbers are a little bit lower. But obviously right along the coastline is where we're expecting our highest rainfall to occur. And essentially, I mean, it's broadly along and south of the I-10 corridor. I know a lot of people don't like me using I-10 as kind of a delineation point, but in this case, it's actually a fairly good proxy for where the highest rainfall totals are going to be, at least based on the current thinking. As we get a little bit further inland, the overall rainfall totals go down a little bit, but we're still looking at 4 to 6 inches, which is certainly enough to cause at least some minor street flooding across the region. Now, as the storm gets better organized, we get a better idea on intensity. This will certainly be adjusted, but be prepared for the significant flash flood threat that comes with heavy rainfall from tropical systems, because that overall is probably going to be our biggest singular risk with this storm, even more so than wind at this point. I showed you this earlier. I'm going to run through this fairly quickly, but generally we're looking at a 60 to 80% chance of seeing greater than 2 inches of rain. That's almost a foregone conclusion at this point. Probabilities of greater than 4 inches of rainfall range between about 30 and 60% near the coast, and then gradually diminishing as we go further inland. And then the probability of seeing greater than 6 inches of rain, again, 30 to 40% right along the coastline, and then a little bit less as you go further inland. These will also rise in time as we get closer to the actual storm making landfall. Now, next in terms of potential severity is going to be the threat for storm surge. We are looking at the possibility of some storm surge with this system. The thing about when we're talking about storm surge threat is the only areas that are going to see storm surge are going to be along and east of the center of circulation. So we're looking at southeast Texas right now, coastal portions of Jefferson and Orange County, and coastal portions of western Cameron Parish. But if we see a landfall where the center of circulation is expected to make landfall based on the current forecast track, these areas would not see any storm surge at all, because you'd be looking at north winds that would actually be pushing water off the coastline. So this is kind of an in case of storm surge graphic in the event that forecast track gets shifted further back to the west. The areas in blue, you can see there, that's 1 foot or more above ground level. The areas in yellow are greater than 3 feet. The areas in the gray, those are general wetlands that are most of the time under some amount of water anyway. So that's not really considered in the forecast model. And of course, you can see the levee systems in and around the Port Arthur area there. Going a little bit further east across coastal portions of Cameron Parish and Calcasieu, southern Calcasieu in the Lake Charles area, you can see that based on the current forecast track, this is actually fairly representative. You can see roughly 1 to 3 feet of surge. There will be a little bit of minor surge in and around Calcasieu Lake and going up the Calcasieu River, and then the typical portions of Cameron Parish that flood in anytime we have any kind of significant southerly wind. We'll be looking at some surge values as well. A little bit further east, this is eastern Cameron Parish, Vermilion Parish, and in and around Vermilion Bay. You can see, again, the areas highlighted in blue are 1 foot above ground level, and the areas highlighted in yellow are greater than 3 feet. These are the areas that are going to experience the most significant storm surge, and of course, that's going to be in and around Vermilion Bay based on the current forecast track. And that would make sense. Usually Vermilion Bay experiences its most significant storm surge anytime we have a strong southeasterly wind. And if the storm winds up being just to the west of that, that's going to put the strongest southeasterly wind pushing water right into Vermilion Bay. So based on the current forecast track, that could potentially be our most significant surge area. Even with a little bit further shift off to the right, we'd still be looking at the most significant surge would be in and around the Vermilion Bay area. Of course, the exception being the levee system that protects the majority of Morgan City. You can see that there. But we are looking at the potential for some storm surge in and around Vermilion Bay based on the current forecast track. And of course, we'll have more specifics in terms of details of that as the storm gets a little bit closer. Taking a quick look at the extended, obviously going all the way out through the middle of next week, very high rain chances, very high flash flood threat. That's pretty much what we've been talking about this whole time. I'm not going to linger on that too much. So that's what we have here from the National Weather Service this evening. I wanted to throw this up here also real quick. These are the times for our next briefings. A lot of people want to know when the next briefing is going to be. These are the schedule, or is the schedule for tomorrow. So we're going to do another one 10:30 a.m. tomorrow morning. We'll have another one at 4 p.m. tomorrow afternoon, and another one at 10:30 p.m. late tomorrow night. So we'll do at least 3 scheduled, and then if we have any kind of significant changes in between those times, we'll provide an impromptu update at that time. So that kind of gives you an idea of what to expect going forward here. Chances are we'll probably do something very similar on Tuesday. We'll play that by ear, and I'll put a schedule out for that tomorrow as well. So that kind of gives you an idea what to expect on that. So that's it for the actual briefing. If you have any questions, feel free to stick around for a little while. If not, everyone have a wonderful rest of your evening. We'll talk to you again tomorrow morning. So let me go ahead and back up here just a bit. We'll go back to the actual forecast track here, and I'll check to see if we have any questions. If you posted your question at the beginning of the briefing, I may not be able to see it. So throw it back in there again if you're still watching. I'll be happy to answer it for you. Okay, just reading through some of the comments here. Looks like some people getting a little testy. Everybody calm down. It's okay. We're going to be all right. We're going to get through this together like a family. Area asks, should we evacuate? Well, that's straight and simple and to the point. There are no evacuation orders in effect for anywhere across the region right now. We do not issue evacuation orders directly as the National Weather Service. Our local emergency management communities and elected officials, they're the ones that issue evacuation orders, and those are the orders that should be followed respectively. If you're under an evacuation order, you absolutely should evacuate. If you're not under an evacuation order, you wouldn't necessarily have to evacuate unless you are in some kind of a sensitive group. If you require electricity, some people have oxygen masks or special medications that have to be filled regularly. If you're in one of those select sensitive groups that have to have certain conditions, you may want to consider evacuating. But in general, we defer to the evacuation orders. So when an evacuation order is issued, you should evacuate at that time. At this point, there are no evacuation orders in effect that I'm aware of. Bill can ask, what will the worst Alexandria will get? Based on the current forecast track, probably not going to be too bad in the Alexandria area. If you look at let me see if I can make the track a little bit bigger here so you can take a little bit closer look at it there. The center of circulation, or what's left of it by the time it gets up that way, based on this track, will track pretty close to Alexandria. But you're only going to be looking at probably some low-end tropical storm force winds. The storm's going to begin to weaken as soon as it moves inland. So I think the biggest threat up your way is going to be the potential for that heavy rainfall. Okay, let's see. Adrienne asks, is there a chance it could become a Category 3? I'm not going to completely rule it out. I don't think it's particularly likely, and the reason for that is twofold. One, it would have to undergo a rapid intensification cycle, which, as I said earlier, there are a few models that are showing that, but it's not a foregone conclusion. It's less likely than more likely at this point. The other thing is, as it approaches the coast, it's going to be running into that wind shear that we talked about a little while ago. So it's going to be encountering some less favorable conditions as it gets into the northern Gulf of Mexico. So do I think it's possible? Yes. Do I think it's likely? Not at this time. Roger asked, do you expect the track to shift east at all? Well, technically, it already has shifted east. With this advisory, it moved about 40 miles to the east of where it was. The last advisory this afternoon was roughly about along Sabine Pass, and now it's roughly about 5 miles east of Lake Charles, or roughly about Cameron at the moment. So it already has shifted a little bit further to the east, and it wouldn't surprise me if it gets nudged a little bit further to the east again. Yeah, that's why we have the cone of uncertainty. I get this question all the time. Could it go a little bit further east? Could it go a little bit further west? Absolutely. Anywhere within that cone of uncertainty is fair game for the storm to wind up moving. Terry's asking about any chance of a Category 2. Yeah, right now the forecast track has it as a kind of a mid-range Category 1, 80-mile-an-hour winds. It wouldn't take a whole lot to bump that up to a Category 2. So yeah, that's well within the range of possibilities. Christina says, will I be sharing these slides? Yes, I can put these slides on. I'll put them on our Facebook and X pages here once the briefing has concluded. TJ asked if the track has shifted more to the east. Yeah, like we talked about a second ago, the forecast track has shifted about 40 miles east from where it was this afternoon. Drew asked, what are the odds for a Category 3 storm? I'd say they're low right now. They're not zero, but they're low for the reasons we just talked about before. Logan asked, what are the potential impacts outside of Southwest Louisiana? Well, it depends what areas you're talking about. We don't cover areas outside of Southeast Texas or Southwest Louisiana, but we're looking at probably pretty decent rainfall totals across Southeast Louisiana. As the storm decays and moves inland, we're going to be looking at pretty copious amounts of rainfall going through North Louisiana, Eastern Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, most of the kind of the eastern parts of the Great Plains. And into parts of Appalachia are going to see some pretty significant rainfall as this moves off to the northeast. Timothy asked, Donald, how large is this storm supposed to be, and how far are the wind fields expected to extend out? Let me see if I can pull that up for you here real quick. Give me just a moment. I don't know off the top of my head, but it is in one of our products. So let me see if I can find it real quick. So at least for right now, I'm trying to look at where the largest it's going to be is probably going to be just prior to landfall. So we're looking at the tropical storm force winds. This is showing about 90 miles in diameter for the tropical storm force winds. And then the hurricane force winds, actually, we're not showing any hurricane force winds on here. The next one would be just strong tropical storm force winds. So roughly about 90 miles for those tropical storm force winds away from the center of circulation. That's kind of what we're looking at right now. That's a forecast, though, and considering we're still talking about a storm that hasn't actually developed a low-level circulation yet, that is very much subject to change. Mark asked, do people have to leave Lake Charles? There are no evacuation orders in effect right now, so no, not at the moment. Audrey asked, Donald, would you evacuate during a Category 1 or Category 2 storm or ride it out? That would depend on a lot of variables that I can't, talk about your specific situation here. I can write it out here at our weather service office. We have a storm shelter that's built to withstand tornadoes, so we can certainly withstand the wind. This building withstood Hurricane Laura with almost no impact. So I have the good fortune of being able to ride out a storm here if necessary. So I would be willing to do that. Others, if you're in a mobile home, if you're closer to the coast and subject to storm surge, I wouldn't recommend it as much. So that's why I'm saying, you need to heed the evacuation orders that are put out, because they're put out with that kind of information in mind. They'll be able to tell you, is your area at risk of seeing significant damage? Now, if you're concerned, if you're afraid, if you're uneasy about it, then there's no harm in evacuating if you have to, or if you feel that you need to. But it's very much an individual circumstance kind of situation. Becky asked, do they expect it to be a fast-moving storm? We expect it to be accelerating as it approaches the coast. Right now, it's not moving very fast at all. We're looking at it moving to the north-northwest at about 5 miles per hour, which is pretty slow. And that's going to continue most likely through probably at least Tuesday evening. Now, you can see in this graphic here, after Tuesday evening, we see these little dots getting further and further apart. That's an indication that we're expecting it to begin to accelerate. It's going to pick up forward speed as it gets picked up by that cold front that's kind of lingering along the coast there. So it will be picking up speed as it makes landfall and accelerating off to the north, kind of northeast. Exactly how fast it's going to be moving at that point, it's difficult to kind of guess from this, but I'd say probably somewhere in the range of between 10 and 15 miles an hour. Dakota asks, what is the chance for rapid intensification? I wouldn't say it's very high at the moment, but there are a few computer models that are showing it as a possibility. I don't want to put an exact probability number on it right now, just off the top of my head, but I'd say it's less likely than more likely, but it's not impossible. Ruby asks, do we know when watches or warnings will be posted? Watches will probably be posted sometime late tomorrow morning, possibly tomorrow afternoon. I think the Hurricane Center indicated that we'd be within the window probably by the 10 a.m. advisory tomorrow morning. So that is most likely when we'd start to see at least tropical storm watches go up for parts of the northern Gulf Coast. I think probably tomorrow morning. Weather 87 says it somewhat looks like the IR satellite that the southwest west side is beginning to contract itself and become a tad less broad. Unsure if it's just me though. What are my thoughts? Yeah, that's what we're expecting to happen. It may or may not be happening right at the moment, but that's generally what we expect will happen as we go through the day tomorrow. That those winds and that shower and thunderstorm activity that's on the west side. Let me see if I can pull that back up here. Okay, there it is. So this activity here will gradually begin to kind of wrap into what we expect to see a developing low-level circulation. Is it happening yet? I wouldn't necessarily say that, but it is expected to happen. Mara says, is the bigger threat for Beaumont flooding or winds? At this point, flooding. Michelle asks, how fast will it weaken once it makes landfall? Hurricanes usually tend to weaken pretty quickly once they make landfall. You'll go from a hurricane to even a major hurricane to a tropical storm in roughly about 12 hours or thereabouts. The weaker the storm, if you're talking about a Category 1 hurricane, it probably becomes a tropical storm within just 4-ish hours of landfall, sometimes less than that. Lorna asks, has it nudged a little to the east since the 5 p.m. briefing? Yes, about 40 miles to the east from the previous advisory with this advisory. Could I ask, are conditions favorable or not for rapid intensification at this point within the next 48 hours? Conditions are generally favorable. They're not particularly favorable for rapid intensification, although again, there are a few models that are showing that. It's not out of the realm of possibility, but conditions aren't necessarily ideal. They're pretty favorable, but they're not perfect necessarily. Kevin asked, do you anticipate further drifting to the east? It wouldn't surprise me at all to see another little nudge to the east. There are several computer models that are bringing the storm in somewhere a little bit further to the east, between like East Cameron, Vermilion Parish, somewhere in that area. That's certainly within the realm of possibility. Do I expect it? Maybe a little bit. I would be surprised if there wasn't a little more of a nudge to the east. I don't expect it to be dramatic, though. Just kind of like we moved about 40 miles between the last advisory and this one, maybe something similar to that by tomorrow morning, but nothing huge. Kimberly says, I'm trying to avoid power outages. How far west would I have to go? Based on the current forecast track, probably Houston. That would probably be a safe distance west. Should the track shift back further to the west, though, then that might be not far enough. It's hard to put an exact number on that, but I think based on the current track, if you were to go to Houston, you'd probably be in good shape for power. All right, I'm getting behind here. I'm trying to catch up a little bit. Todd's asking me, since we don't have a center yet, how many miles east of west of the official forecast track are we looking at? Todd's actually a former employee here, so he's probably just repeating this over and over again because everybody keeps asking the same question. But generally speaking, again, we're looking at a storm system. Anywhere within this cone of uncertainty is still at risk for seeing potential the center of circulation drift either left or right. Now, most of the computer guidance in the last few hours has trended a little bit to the east or to the right of the center of circulation. But it's not out of the realm of possibility that could backtrack a little bit. We could see a little bit more of a shift back to the west, depending on exactly how strong and how far west that area of high pressure in the eastern Gulf of Mexico actually winds up building in. That's kind of the driving force behind this at the moment. Timothy asks, how fast is the estimated wind speed it'll be traveling at landfall, or the estimated speed, not the wind speed? Like I said, I think we're probably going to be somewhere between about 10 and 15 miles per hour at landfall. Cajun Killa 94. Should I expect Category 1 or tropical storm force winds here in Lafayette Parish? Based on the current forecast track, the one you see behind me here, probably just tropical storm force winds. If this track were to shift further to the east and the storm were to intensify, even if the storm were to be a low-end Category 1 hurricane at landfall and taking a direct track to Lafayette, you probably wouldn't see hurricane force winds. You would need a strong Category 1, maybe a low-end Category 2 to get hurricane force winds, those 75-mile-per-hour winds, into Lafayette proper. Brooklyn says, if it becomes a Category 2, will it hit Alexandria as a hurricane? You probably would not get hurricane force winds as far north as Alexandria with a Category 2, no. Rachel says, I saw you mention the high pressure from the east. Is there one from the west that will affect the steering any? Not really. Like we talked about before, it's going to be the combination of that high pressure over the eastern Gulf of Mexico. There it is. And this cold front that's over the northern Gulf Coast here. So cold front here, high pressure here. High pressure winds moving clockwise. That was a terrible arrow. Around the high pressure center. That's what's initially going to be driving it to the north. Then this cold front is going to kind of take over and kick it off to the north-northeast. There's not a whole lot across Mexico or West Texas that's really going to be driving this storm. Okay. Leo says, why hasn't anyone figured out a way to drop something in the middle of these hurricanes to break them up so we don't have to experience all of this every year? What you have to understand about that is hurricanes, the amount of energy released in a hurricane in a single day, just one 24-hour period, is enough to power the entire electrical needs of the United States for a year. That's the kind of energy we're talking about here. A nuclear bomb would not put out that kind of energy. Okay, even if we dropped the nuclear bomb right into the middle of the storm, besides the nuclear fallout and the devastation that would wreak, all of that aside, it still would not be enough energy to disrupt a well-defined hurricane. That's why we haven't figured out a way to do it yet, because we cannot harness that amount of energy to materially disrupt a tropical system. Rita says, do you think the Lake Charles Airport will be able to operate Tuesday morning around 7 a.m.? Probably. At that point, we will probably see some outer rain bands possibly getting into the area by then, but even that might be too early for that. So yeah, I don't see any problems with that Tuesday morning. Now by Wednesday morning, it might be a different story. Amanda said, did I mention tornado risk? I didn't have any graphics for it yet, but yes, tornadoes are going to be a risk as the storm approaches and moves inland. Those risks are not clearly defined yet, which is why I don't have a graphic for it yet. But yet any landfalling tropical system is capable of producing tornadoes. We saw a whole bunch of them during Beryl earlier this year. So yes, that is definitely going to be a risk, generally along and east of the center of circulation, just like where that's where the strongest winds are. That's also where the highest tornado threat is, historically speaking, in tropical cyclones. A few people asking about the New Orleans area. Based on the current forecast track, the wind threat in New Orleans is going to be relatively low. Now, you are going to potentially be looking at some low-end storm surge, or probably the better term to use is coastal flooding in and around the New Orleans area when you have a strong or fairly breezy southerly wind, assuming that this forecast track verifies. So yeah, there will be some coastal flooding. You're certainly going to be dealing with some heavy rainfall. We don't explicitly cover that area. This office only covers Southeast Texas and Southwest Louisiana. There is a weather forecast office that covers New Orleans. It's actually located in Slidell, and they've done a Facebook Live. Actually, they did one earlier this afternoon. I saw it on there, so you can check theirs out on their Facebook page and get the latest and greatest from them regarding the expected impacts across the New Orleans area. Jeff asked, when are you doing a parish by parish forecast? I usually like to wait until roughly about 24 hours beforehand before I start talking about the parish by parish impacts. We will do them as the storm gets closer, don't worry. But we're not there yet. We don't even have a center of circulation at this point. So we actually have to have a storm before we start talking about individual parish and county impacts. But those will be coming, so don't worry. Probably going to be on Tuesday if I had to put a day on it right now. But we'll see how things develop. Oh, here's the kind of hard-hitting questions that I look for. If God said there will be no hurricanes if you shave your beard, would you shave your beard? Absolutely. 100%. I'd shave it twice. I'd shave it and keep it shaved. I'd shave every hair on my body if we didn't have to deal with hurricanes again. And yours too, Ian. We're both going to be bald. Unfortunately, that's not a way to deal with it either. Stephen asks, is it possible that it'll weaken down to a tropical storm by the time it hits Lake Charles? It depends on how strong it is to begin with as it approaches the coast. The thing about, if we're looking at landfall along Cameron Parish, the problem with Cameron Parish, is that it is mostly water still. So storms actually tend to weaken a little bit slower as they go across Cameron Parish because there's still a lot of water in the swamps and the wetlands areas that can actually slow down reduce the storm's ability to break down. Essentially, there's actually been studies done on that. I think it's called the brown water effect. But it's actually a storm using water that's inland or sometimes using its own rainfall to continue to gain energy. So that's something that actually has to be taken into consideration as well when we're talking about a storm moving across Cameron Parish. If we have a weak Category 1 hurricane at landfall, will we get hurricane force winds in Lake Charles? Probably not. If we're looking at a Category 2, then yeah, probably. If we're looking at it moving directly across Cameron and into the Lake Charles area. So it just depends on the angle of approach. It depends on how strong it is. That's a little bit more complicated question than it kind of sounds on the surface. Susan's asking about the Marksville of Boyles Parish. Will the wind be a big event? That far inland? Probably not. It's certainly going to be breezy, but you're not going to be looking at hurricane force winds that far inland. Chances of tornadoes, since you're on the, quote, dirty side, yeah, there will be the potential, assuming that the storm stays to the west of you and you're on the east side, there will be the potential for tornadoes, yes. Kayla says, since it has shifted more west, let me correct you right there. It hasn't shifted more west. It actually shifted 40 miles further to the east since the last advisory. So it's actually moving away from southeast Texas, at least the official forecast is right now. What can be expected in southeast Texas? Based on right now, you're going to be looking at north winds, so there would not be any surge in southeast Texas if this forecast were to verify. Well, I take that back. As the storm approaches from the north side, you may get a little bit of surge, but you wouldn't be looking at significant storm surge in southeast Texas as long as the storm remains to your east or to your right. Heavy rainfall would probably be your biggest overall risk based on this current forecast track. But again, that is subject to change. We're going to be looking at some fluctuation there. All right, I'm getting way behind. I'm like 20 minutes behind on these questions. I'm going to scroll down a little bit. I'm going to have to miss some. I'm sorry. Chrissy asks, do you think our new electric infrastructure can handle a Category 2? I haven't been through a low category hurricane here in Lake Charles. I frankly do not know. I'm not a electrical infrastructure expert. I have no idea how the new one compares to the old and how well it would hold up compared to the old. You'd have to talk to Entergy or an electrical engineer for that information. That's way beyond my knowledge base. Courtney asks, do y'all give tornado warnings during storms? During tropical storms and hurricanes? Yes. There's actually been some debate about whether we should or not, but at least as of now, yes, we do issue tornado warnings when we're able to see a tornado or rotation signature on radar, which is not always the case during tropical systems. Sometimes they can be very hard to see. So you can have tornadoes touch down without warning in tropical systems. It has happened. It'll probably continue to happen. But yes, if we do see a signature of a tornado, we do issue tornado warnings during hurricanes. Kelly asks, when you say the eye passes at 7 p.m. Wednesday, how long before that should you be locked down? We were talking about those the onset of those tropical storm force winds, that's when I would recommend having any preparations complete and pretty much being in whatever shelter you're planning on locking down in. So our most likely time of arrival for tropical storm force winds is going to be between about 8 a.m. and noon on Wednesday. That's when I would be prepared to be locked down by, if you're planning on riding out the storm. Sheila asked, do you expect impacts in Dallas or just south of Dallas area? Not right now based on the current forecast track. It'll probably certainly be breezy. You might see a little bit of rain with it, but I wouldn't expect significant impacts. Tini's asking about landfall timing. We're generally expecting landfall right now to be sometime Wednesday evening. There's the forecast track there. I'm estimating, just looking at that, probably between about, I've been saying between about 4 p.m. and midnight. That graphic has about 7 p.m. It looks like it's just inland by that point. So that's kind of the time frame we're looking at. Late Wednesday afternoon into Wednesday evening is when we're expecting landfall. Michael's asking about the projected rainfall. Let me pull that graphic up here. We are looking at, here's our general rainfall expectations, at least for right now. You can see the swath of generally 6 to 8 inches along the immediate, essentially along and south of the I-10 corridor from Beaumont to Lake Charles over towards Lafayette. And then as we get north of I-10, between about 4 and 6 inches of rain. North of that, between about 2 and 4. And then once you get up towards the Shreveport area, we're looking at generally less than an inch. Southeast Louisiana Extreme Weather says, looks like GO16 is having issues unless it's a data issue with the satellite imagery. Y'all got any info on that? I don't have any info on it personally. I do know it looked like it was having some issues last night with some images coming in and out. I can't tell you why. I don't know. I haven't seen any reasoning for that. Kimberly says, if someone within 50 miles of the Louisiana-Texas border decided to evacuate out of medical precaution, do you suggest they go northwest or just west and out of the cone? Keep in mind, the cone, and this is very important. I'm going to answer your question, but I kind of want to go on a side tangent here for a second. The cone is not an indication of where impacts can occur. Impacts, flooding, winds, rain, surge can happen well outside of the cone. The cone is not a delineation of where the impacts will happen. So keep that in mind. You can have impacts that fall well outside of the cone of uncertainty. The cone of uncertainty is just there for the center of circulation only. It says nothing about how far the impacts will go. Okay, with that in mind, where would I suggest you go? Northwest is good, west is good. At this point, based on the current forecast track, Houston's probably good. Shreveport would also be good if you wanted to go that way. That would be my recommendations at the moment. The fact that this track is probably more likely to shift a little bit more further to the east would lend credence to the idea of going west, at least at this point. Brenda says, how come she's 50-mile-per-hour sustained winds, but they're still calling her TD6 instead of TS Francine? Well, first off, they're not calling her TD6 because she's not a TD. She's not a tropical depression. She is nothing at the moment. It is a potential tropical cyclone is the official designation. I know that sounds kind of stupid. I get that. The reason that it's called a potential tropical cyclone is because it doesn't actually have a closed low-level circulation at this point. That's one of the requirements to have a tropical cyclone, a tropical storm, hurricane, depression, whatever the case may be. It has to have a closed low-level circulation. It doesn't have that right now. It's essentially just what's called a trough. It's an elongated area of low pressure. So it's not tropical by nature or by definition at the moment. Once it gains that low-level center of circulation, it already has the winds to be a tropical storm. So it'll be upgraded from nothing to a tropical storm. There won't be a tropical depression phase with it. So it'll go directly to tropical storm with 50-mile-per-hour sustained winds. We expect that to happen tomorrow, and at that point, it'll get its name. But right now, it is a nameless feature, just a little trough. I know that's semantics, but you got to draw the line somewhere. Joel says, how soon are we looking for it to rain? We're looking at rain beginning probably sometime midday Tuesday. That's when we're expecting to start to see some of these bands get in here. All right, I'm getting way behind again. I'm going to have to scroll down. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to miss a few questions. I'm still back at 11 o'clock, and it's almost 11:30. And also, we're going to have to wrap up here soon, because I got to do a forecast before I go home. Suji asked, what is the likelihood of a high volume of tornado outbreaks? It's very, very difficult to say how many tornadoes a hurricane is going to produce. In the instance of Hurricane Beryl, which made landfall, back in what was that, late June, early July, we had a lot of tornadoes with that storm. But there are other storms that don't produce hardly any, maybe one, maybe two. So there's not a. I mean, there is some science behind different storms producing different amounts of tornadoes, but it's not something that's really that we can really predict for each individual storm ahead of time. There are different parameters that tend to promote more or fewer tornadoes. But just like with any severe weather event, you can have, when we have those cold fronts roll through, sometimes we have a lot of tornadoes when we're expecting them, and sometimes we have very few or none. Okay, sorry, trying to catch up on questions. I'm sorry, I'm missing a few. I'm going to go ahead and real quick here, I'll throw up my email and our phone number here. If you do have a question that I missed, feel free to send me an email or feel free to give us a ring. We'll be happy to answer your questions. You can also send us a direct message on Facebook. You can also send us a tweet, or no, it's not a tweet anymore. Now it's an X. Send us an X, or you can also message us on Instagram. I'm just going to do a couple of more here that I'm going to have to get off. I got to go do a forecast. Becky says, why do a lot of storms hit at nighttime? There's no rhyme or reason to that. That's just kind of luck of the draw, for lack of a better term. There's no scientific basis to storms hitting at night versus daytime. Elizabeth says, when is it supposed to become a named storm? Looks like sometime tomorrow, once it gets that low-level circulation. So probably tomorrow, maybe tomorrow afternoon, maybe a little bit earlier if we're lucky. But it's probably going to be, or if we're not lucky, but it's probably going to be sometime during the day tomorrow. Kathy asks, is there any potential for training with this system? Yes, absolutely. In fact, that's one of our biggest fears. Anytime we get those bands training over the same area, dumping heavy rainfall for a long period of time, that's where we get the real catastrophic flooding. And yes, that is going to be a threat with this system. It's the threat with almost all tropical systems. Garrett says, how did my fantasy football team do today? I don't know. I got to wait till tomorrow. I got players playing on Monday. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and have to wrap up here for the time being. I'm sorry if I missed your question. Again, feel free to send us a direct message on Facebook. Feel free to send me an email directly. I'll be happy to answer your questions that way. I just got to get off here and go do a forecast real quick. We are going to provide another update here tomorrow morning. We're going to plan on doing it at 10:30. So feel free to tune in for that again tomorrow morning, 10:30, 4 o'clock, and 10:30 tomorrow night. That's going to be our schedule for the day tomorrow for these live briefings. We will do another one if necessary. If there's some kind of crazy development, we will do another one in between that. But that's going to be our plan for now. So 10:30, 4, and 10:30 tomorrow. In the meantime, everyone have a wonderful rest of your evening. It's about bedtime. You all need to go to bed. I need to go to bed. We all need to go to bed. It's going to be a long couple of days, few days coming up here. So go get some rest. And in the morning, we'll probably still have some fairly nice weather out there for the last day of false fall, as we're calling it. The first taste of fall. It was actually pretty nice out there today. But we will see you tomorrow, 10:30 a.m. sharp. Be here. In the meantime, everyone have a wonderful rest of your evening. We'll talk to you again tomorrow.